welcome to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 88, and this is the current economic collapse news brief for Saturday. And let's get into the economic collapse news. Now, home repossessions are up 11% in May. Basically, home repossessions in the U.S. increased by 11%. Foreclosure filings were also up by 2.3%, and this is according to a report by RealtyTrack. And basically what the banks have been doing is they've been sitting tight on these repossessions for the past few months, waiting to see what the economy does. And basically, as the housing bubble has been pumped up, now it's time to cash in on these bad mortgages. And the first-time default notices have also increased by 4% last month. That means we are seeing an increase for sure. So basically, they kept these homes on their books, and they waited because they didn't want to get rid of them and show these tremendous losses. So they kept them on their books and waited for the housing bubble to push the prices back up, and now they can start releasing some of these homes. So when we heard reports of the amount of foreclosures and repossessions and all these things, they weren't really true because they were doing some tricky accounting on the bank side by keeping these on the books, and people haven't been paying for this. And actually, I do know of a couple people who've been living in their homes. The bank has done absolutely nothing, and they haven't paid their mortgage in a year and a half. And basically what's happening is they're just letting them ride it out because it's cheaper to do that than to take that huge loss and show the bank losing all this money. And they rather keep the house on their books. Now, there was an article that says the major stock market crash is dead ahead. And basically, the Bank of International Settlements warns of stock market crash. There's no economic recovery. However, the loose monetary policies of central banks drives the share prices to record highs. Therefore, the Biz warns of a bubble formation. And basically, we know this. And the Fed and central banks, they are in a bind because if they continually pump more money into the system, basically the end effect will be a collapse. If they decide to taper or stop the pumping of this money into the economy, their end result is a collapse. So they don't know what to do at this point. And basically, if they just stop right now and they taper off, the collapse will come sooner than if they continually pump up the market. But as they keep pumping it up, the collapse is larger. And they pumped it up so high that they can keep this going, but not much longer, and it doesn't really matter at this point. So they're in a tough bind. They know the collapse is coming. They don't know which way to turn, and this is why we're seeing things occur all over the world, especially with the terms of service and banks change, the bail-in documentation that we see in Canada, in Europe, in Japan, in the United States, in England. They did a test run in Cyprus, and they're doing this for one reason, because they know eventually this whole thing is going to come to an end, and the only way out of it is to try to get everyone's money, but that will only keep them going for a short period of time. And I gave this example in the last episode that, it's like a family who has $20,000 and they're no longer making an income, and they're just using up to $20,000. They either borrow $3,000 or they sell the car for $3,000. They use that up, and by the time you're done, there's nothing left because you have no income coming in. These countries, just like the United States, Japan, there's nothing bringing in enough money to cover this massive debt. So we're in a very big bind here, and we know that the end result is a major, major collapse. Now, moving on, there was an article that says 7 reasons war with Syria is really bad idea. And the first reason is preemptive war is murder. Plain and simple. America used to be the country that only went to war as a last result to defend itself. Now war is used as a hammer to occupy new territory at the whims of bloodthirsty chicken hawks. And basically what has happened is we are invading all these countries, not we, the United States government and the central bankers are invading these countries, trying to keep the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency of the world. That is why the United States is in all of these countries to maintain control. And basically, the United States, the central bankers, are losing control because you can't be everywhere forcing everyone to keep to the deal that they struck back in 1947, which was Bretton Woods. Australia made a deal with China to bypass the U.S. dollar. Iran, Syria are bypassing the U.S. dollar. That whole entire North Korea propaganda thing with them, where the news was exaggerating and propagandizing the use of nuclear weapons on the United States was because North Korea was making a deal with Iran to bypass the U.S. dollar. And what did the central bank and government do? They created this whole thing demonizing North Korea. And once the deal was made, you notice how that completely disappeared. And you never heard about it again, pretty much. So, Russia has a deal with China. Brazil has a deal with China. These all nations are India has a deal with China. All these nations are bypassing the U.S. dollar, and the United States government and central bank, they're losing the battle, and they will completely lose the battle. Now here, let's move on to number 2. The rebels are terrorists. This is now a fact that shows the massive hypocrisy of military intervention in yet another sovereign nation. The rebels who are now being openly supported are the very same al-Qaeda-connected death squads that decimated Libya just a short while ago. In fact, the USA Today reports today that the rebels have pledged loyalty to al-Qaeda. This is the same al-Qaeda that Americans have been told lurks under every bed and is ready to strike, thus justifying the Constitution to be reduced to nothing but suggestions. And basically, al-Qaeda is the hired mercenaries that the central bank and the government and the agencies of the government use to create these uprisings in other countries. They did it in Lebanon, they did it in Libya, they did it in Iraq, and we actually went in and we just used force in Iraq because all of those nations decided that they were not going to use the U.S. dollar, the petrodollar, to sell their oil. They decided to use different currency. Some was gold, some was other currency. And again, the government and the central bankers could not let this happen. So basically, they had to take over all of these countries and turn them back and put the central banks back into place. Let's move on to number 3. No weapons of mass destruction. The Syrian government has repeatedly denied having any weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons. Evidence that rebels themselves used sarin gas, and not only the rebels themselves, but from these affected by these weapons, even the United Nations before they changed their story. Basically, the rebels gassed the Syrian people. The United Nations went in and they said that Syria, the government, did not use chemical weapons. The United States kept on pushing, and the UN went back in and they said, yeah, maybe both sides did. And then all of a sudden, the red line was crossed, and here we are supplying weapons to the rebels and trying to get this war started. Number 4. Humanitarian catastrophe. More intervention would only deepen the humanitarian disaster. U.S. efforts to support the rebels have already led to a humanitarian nightmare in a country that welcomed people of all religions and where women have unprecedented rights in the region. And the U.S., the government has tried the humanitarian reason to get into there that people are being killed and maimed and all these other things, but again, it is not working. And most of Congress and America do not agree to go to war. They believe that we shouldn't even be there, actually. Number 5, Iran has a mutual defense agreement with Syria, which would force them into a broader war. Now, this is very important. For years, the government and central banks tried to get into Iran to switch them from from not using the petrodollar, and they want to implement the central bank in there because they need to spread more debt to keep the system going. They tried for many years with this ridiculous nuclear weapons of mass destruction that they're building, which they're not. The UN inspectors have been in there many times, and they reported that they're not. And basically, to get to Iran, they decided to go through Syria because they knew if they can get through Syria, Iran and Syria have a pact, and Iran would be brought into the war, and they can get to Syria, then get to Iran. That's what they're trying to do. Number 6, Russia and China. Both Russia and China have warned the U.S. against attacking Syria, which they correctly see as the final domino to fall before the move to Iran. Reports have indicated that both nations have made moves to thwart the intentions of the U.S. and Israel. Russia has stated that it will send anti-aircraft missiles to Syria, while it has been conducting its own military readiness exercises in southern Russia. Russia 3-day exercises include 8,700 personnel, 185 warplanes, and 240 armored vehicles. And basically, Russia they know what's going on here. They know it's the central bankers. Actually, Russia kicked out their central bankers, Putin paid off their debt, and they know exactly what is going on. They know exactly what they're trying to do. And the central bankers don't care. They don't care if Russia or China backs them. They want World War III. They want this to be pushed on. But the government has restrictions. Something called the Constitution. The Congress has to say we're going to war. The American people have to say we want to go to war. But guess what? We don't right now. So the only way to change the American people and to change Congress is to shock them with a bloody, horrific, false flag to show and wake up everyone that we need to go to war. And let's go to number 7. America's broke. Let's not forget who ultimately pays for these military campaigns and reaps none of the benefits. Besides empty platitudes about increased safety, the military-industrial complex, as well as the banks, the finance, we don't have the finances. We don't have the tax revenue. We have 17 trillion. There's more. It's like 50 trillion in debt. We are tired of war. We do not have the manpower, and if we do go to war, it doesn't look like we will be on the winning side here if you're living in the United States. All right, let's move on here. Now, the Turkish police take over Taksim Square. Protesters were running in panic as riot police and water cannons returned to Istanbul, and they pretty much blasted all the people, and they cleared the square. Now, that doesn't mean the protesters aren't going to come back. Listen, if you're standing in a square and they're shooting water cannons at you, basically, I would run too. Okay, let's move on here. Now, constitutionally illiterate Michael Bloomberg doesn't want the Department of Justice monitoring his stop and frisk military. Basically, Michael Bloomberg was at an audience at MIT, and he pretty much says, I don't listen to Washington very much, which is something they're not thrilled about. He didn't listen because he didn't have to. I have my own army in the NYPD, which is the 7th biggest army in the world, Bloomberg bragged. Basically, the U.S. Department of Justice filed papers Wednesday saying that if a federal judge ruled the NYPD's practices unconstitutional, then the Department of Justice would strongly endorse the use of monitor to oversee changes of the department. And basically, in New York, what they have right now is they're breaking the Fourth Amendment. And as you walk down the street, the police have every right to frisk you first and then ask questions later. So there, no warrant, nothing, and this is completely unconstitutional. Bloomberg has violated his oath. Every police officer has violated their oath, and they're violating all the rights of all the people. Now, there was an interesting video on cyber attacks, and I linked the video on this page. It's not in a player, so you're going to have to download it, and I have the link on the page of this report right here. And basically what it goes on to say, and I believe this was made in Australia, a blackout hits major cities. Streets flood, trains grind to a halt, banks lose data simultaneously. A large-scale strategic attack is executed within minutes over the Internet. It sounds far-fetched, but the U.S. is taking the threat of a cyber 9/11 very seriously. President Barack Obama says now our enemies are also seeking the ability to sabotage our power grid, our financial institutions, our air traffic control systems. We cannot look back years from now and wonder why we did nothing in the face of these real threats to our security and economy. And if you haven't seen this video, you should view this. I have the link right on the page. You can download it. It's an MP4, and you can download the video and take a look at it. And they go through the cyber attack of what would happen, and it's just amazing how all of this news of cyber attacks and everything are coming out, and we're learning more and more that the U.S. have been using cyber attacks in other countries, just like in the previous episode about Gmail experiencing cyber attacks with malware, and during the presidential elections in Iran, which is what a coincidence that is, which I do not believe in coincidences. But we will see some type of cyber attack here in the States. We will also see it probably around the world, and this will be the main event to get us into World War III if all else fails. It will also enable the central banks and the powers to rob the people of the rest of their money and their wealth. It will allow the governments to declare martial law. It will allow them to enact the executive orders, which puts us in a state of emergency, and all power goes to the president, and the president does not need the permission of Congress to do this. And this is what we are looking at. Listen, everyone, thank you very much for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.